Okay, so now that I've already explained to you the basics of evaluating arguments, and I've outlined or given you a flow chart of the three main positions on the free will debate, I want to make very quick points on this scientific explanation argument. This is the argument given in handout 1.5. I went over this argument in class, and I'm not going to go over it again, but I want to raise two objections to this hard determinist position now that you have some kind of background in evaluating arguments. So again, the scientific explanation argument, handout 1.5, aims to establish conclusion 7, which says human actions cannot be scientifically explained by free will. Right? And all the premises in this argument are aimed to try to get you to believe that conclusion. As I talked earlier, there are sub-conclusions to this argument. So premise 2, for example, is claimed to follow from premise 1. Now notice, given the notion of validity that I explained earlier, the inference from premise 1 to 2 is a valid inference. That is, that little argument is a valid one if it's impossible for premise 2 to be false if we assume premise 1 is true. If that inference is not a valid one, then the whole argument falls apart. So whenever you're evaluating arguments, each step of the argument has to be a valid argument for it to be a good argument, and a sound one. The premises actually have to be true. But in any case, I'm not going to go over the argument again. I just want to make a couple of points. So remember, a libertarian believes that determinism for human actions is false, and they also believe that we have free will. Now, in terms of the argument given in 1.5, you might think that a libertarian, or you might characterize a libertarian as rejecting the truth of premise 5. So premise 5 in the scientific explanation argument says human action is in its entirety susceptible to scientific explanation. So a libertarian might say, well, premise 5 is false. It's not true that we can explain human actions in terms of science. Well, if that's not true, then the inference to premise 6 in the scientific explanation argument, even though it might be valid, it's not a sound inference. Meaning, I have no reason to believe premise 6 if premise 5 is false, if it turns out, as the libertarian might say. I have no reason to believe premise 6 is true. But if I have no reason to believe premise 6 is true, then of course I have no reason to believe conclusion 7 is true. So one way a libertarian might object to the scientific explanation argument is to say it's false that human action is in its entirety susceptible to scientific explanation. So a libertarian might think we have free will, we just can't explain it scientifically. But just because we can't explain free will scientifically doesn't mean free will doesn't exist. That's kind of the lines a libertarian might take. Now let's move over to a soft compatibilist position. Now, a soft compatibilist, what they might want to say is that premise 3 is false. So premise 3 in the scientific explanation argument says actions done from a free will could have been other than what they were. Actions done from a free will are not necessary actions. But a soft compatibilist might disagree and say, well, it's not true that all actions done from a free will are necessary. Maybe there are some actions that are necessary, they couldn't have been otherwise, but yet they're still free. Now remember, I explained in class that a free action is one that comes from you, not from something outside or not from your neurochemicals, but in some way it kind of comes from your choosing. So a libertarian might say, well, an action can come from my choosing even though it could not have been any other way. That's one way to argue for a soft determinist position. And again, if premise 3 is false, you can't make the inference to premise 4. You can't make the inference to premise 4, and you can't make the inferences all the way down to conclusion 7. So then a soft compatibilist has reason to reject the hard determinist argument. So here I've just given you an example of how we have an argument in 1.5 and two possible objections that object to the truth of certain premises, in which case these objections are saying that the argument will turn out to be unsound. Now remember, if an argument is unsound, it means its premises are not true. But if its premises are not true, then I have no reason to accept the argument's conclusion. Because in order to accept an argument's conclusion, I have to accept it as true, right?